Hello, and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Antonio López and Jenny Key for their books Hintification and Focal Points. My name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is your first time hearing about us, you're joining from the West Coast, welcome. It's so cool to have all of you join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of these authors, their amazing books, and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. And now allow me to introduce these incredible authors we have here tonight. Jenny Key is a writer and scientist. Her essays and poems have been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tin House, and elsewhere. She has received fellowships and support from Tin House, Omnidon, Kearney Street Workshop, and the San Francisco Writers Grotto. Her scientific and academic writing has covered topics including health insurance policy, diversity in medicine, medical humanities, hospice care, and mental health in academia. Born in Pennsylvania to Chinese immigrants, she grew up mostly in Las Vegas and Nashville, but now lives in San Francisco, where she completed her PhD in cancer biology. At the end of graduate school, she co-founded, co-hosted, and produced the podcast Bone Lab Radio. She is currently in the process of translating her late mother's memoirs of the Chinese Cultural Revolution and her subsequent immigration to the United States. Jenny is the author of Focal Points, winner of the 2020 Steel Toe Books Poetry Award. It is a scientist's unofficial dissertation, a daughter's correspondence, and a coming-of-age story, and we are lucky enough to get to hear a little bit of it tonight. And allow me to introduce Antonio López. Antonio is a poetician working at the intersection of poetry and politics and social change. He has received literary scholarships to attend the community of writers at Squaw Valley, Tin House, the Vermont Studio Center, and Breadloaf. He is a proud member of the Macondo Writers Workshop and a Canto Mundo Fellow. He holds degrees from Duke University, Rutgers Newark, and the University of Oxford. He's currently pursuing a PhD in modern thought and literature at Stanford University. Antonio is currently fighting gentrification in his hometown as the newest and youngest council member for the city of East Palo Alto. His debut poetry collection, Gentefication, was selected by Gregory Pardlow as the winner of the 2019 Levis Prize in Poetry. Gentefication nuances Latinidad as not just an immigration question, but an academic one. And we are lucky enough to get to hear a little bit of Hintification as well. Everyone, please welcome Antonio López and Jenny Key. Hooray!
All right, thanks everyone. I guess we decided that I would go first because I asked who would go first. So thank you so much, Bonnie. She said my name is Jenny Key. Very excited to be here with you guys. I'm going to read a few poems first from my debut poetry collection, Focal Point, which I'm going to hold up in front of my face because otherwise it blends in with my background. And I will start with so I guess backtracking a little, I should mention that I wrote most of this book while I was completing my PhD in cancer biology. And so there are a lot of influences from the lab, a lot of poems with scientific influences that I didn't even recognize until I was putting this book together. And I was also writing this book in the wake of my mother's death. My mother passed away from cancer a few months before I started my program. And so there's a lot of grief and growing up in this book. So I'm going to start now with the very first poem. The title of this first poem is the definition of a focal point in optics. So this is point at which parallel waves converge and from which diverge. Researcher, prevention won't save my life, tweets a patient with metastatic cancer. I'm reminded of my mother. why don't you want to study cancer? When I expressed interest in HIV. In the hospital, call from a professor, my mother clapping once, then silence. The roommate 30 years her senior, who called my voice lovely, who called my mother lucky, whom I resented because she outlived my mother. Nights at a microscope, in a dark room where the lights turn off after 10, sitting too still, turning a knob just so to focus on the right field of cells. The 800 mice I've sacrificed this year, injecting cancer, harsh medicine into their soft, warm bodies, hating them for biting me, but understanding, stroking their white fur in apology, covering cages with paper so they can't watch their sisters die. But I can, and I see my mother in those graying eyes I refuse to donate because how would she see? And I think how cruelly futile all this erratically focused empathy, how brutal to learn why I couldn't save what I couldn't save. As you might imagine, much of this book is sad, but I'm not just going to read the sad poems. So next I'm going to read some really short biology lesson poems. And these are poems that I wrote in the first years of grad school when I was learning how to grow cells in a dish for my experiments and just how to be a scientist and like how to like be a grown-up. And I wrote these thinking about the parallels between how cells behave and how humans behave, as we are composed of many cells. And in this book, these poems are separated by like other scenes from like my non-lab life, and I mostly won't read those. So I'll read a couple of these. Biology lesson 1. Cells need touch. Isolated cells wither, float away in a blood-red sea. Biology lesson 2. Too much touch stifles. Even the toughest cells die, wanting room to breathe. Biology lesson 3. Heart cells beat spontaneously in vitro, given proper nourishment. I'm also going to read the poem that appears after biology lesson 3. So I moved to San Francisco for grad school, and it hasn't always been easy to live here. Prior to this, I grew up in Las Vegas, actually, and then I lived in Nashville during college, and it's just been like a lot of changes in place and in how I respond to those places. So this is kind of a poem about adjusting to place. Transplant. Friday night in San Francisco. The fog, a cold wall boxing me in. Insular contempt driving me out. Get out of our city. Go back to where you came from. Techie scum. Chink. Never mind that chinks like me built this city. Dusted its hills and creaky trains with their bones, painted bridges with their blood. Sunday morning, I am sitting in a free patch of sun in the park, watching the first dogs arrive, sniff new tails with suspicion. I don't need you to remind me I'm not from around here. A transplant that won't take, like the first foreign hearts rejected by the body, before scientists learned how to make them beat as if they always belonged. Well, I leave plenty of time for Antonio to read his work, so I think I'm just gonna read one more, I think. And I will go with one of the last poems in the book that I think of as sort of my love poem to California and to San Francisco, a place that I was not born in, but one that I definitely think of as home now. When this is all over, here is what I will miss. Running through the park, even when I hated it, cursed my legs for their sourness. The heron walking into the pond, small white reflection emerging from the verdure. So lush it brushes the sky teal. Bees floating from poppy to lupine to cobweb thistle. Tender hum and churn, like waves lapping the shore, like language, like love so certain. How could it be any other way? Even the fog, that cool gray mist stalking the shoreline, feeding redwoods pale honey from a mercurial god, feasting on city lights in waning hours. And at the end, squinting into the bright ocean, once described by the Greeks as wine, because they didn't have words for the color blue, or there wasn't yet blue, or maybe they were drunk off its immensity. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Jenny, that was beautiful. I love it. I know poets snap and all that, but I think we're still people of percussion. Thank you so much, Jenny, for warming up and to really set the tone and stage. I love how reflective the poems are. Like, I love how much they really sink into the different materials you're working with. So thank you for gracing us with your work. Yeah, thank you. Needed that this week. So I'm honored to, once again, I want to thank Brookline and everyone for making this happen, everyone who's tuning in, wherever you are in part of the world, and with everything happening, just making poetry a priority. That's already changing so much. And honored that you are deciding to take this time to share it with us. And I hope that this conversation, this dialogue of letters, moves your life in some way that you need to too. So gonna keep the Bay Area love going and gonna read from my work, Hintification. So this is from the good folks of Four-Way Books. Shout out to Martha Rhodes and Ryan Murphy and Hannah and everyone who made this book possible, and Greg as well. Really, it's a book about this nerdy kid from this small city of 30,000 people called East Palo Alto that you otherwise would not know about, but to me is so much about this country and civil rights and the history of housing and discrimination and what it means for Black and brown folks in the Bay to afford, Asian folks, other communities to make this place a living, and what are the things that are keeping us back from that. So the book engages through those ideas, through this trajectory of this, nerdy brown kid from EPA who then goes off to different universities, PWIs, predominantly white institutions. So it's a very nerdy book. It's a very academic book. So I think it complements the quirkiness of Jenny's book and science as well. I think we both got quirky books, so I'm glad that we have today's pairing with our books. So I'm gonna read just a couple poems from it because I'm excited to hear what questions you all have and to dialogue with Jenny. So, see, Jenny did the smart thing and had Post-it notes, and I'm just going through the tip of contents, and then I'll go from there. But I do know what I'm going to read. So the book is organized like a syllabus, and the syllabus has different phases of my childhood, my upbringing. So it's organized like the first one is a course description. The second one is text. The third one is learning goals. The third one is text. The fourth one is DBQ, like AP US history research. And the fifth one is your final. So I'm going to read to you the first section of it. And kind of it goes through my childhood. So this poem is called Cheat Code to Second Base. Right? Cheat Code to Second Base. Because when I was little, we didn't have much internet. We had the DSL, And to play games, like I had to go to my cousin's house in Oakland, and he had to like do the dial-up, and you couldn't call. His mom couldn't call through it, so you had to hear like the and you had to like have no one else use the internet. So that's how I got my cheat codes for video games. So this poem's called Cheat Code to Second Base. When Rosemary smiles at me, it makes my cheeks hurt, like when I eat a sour strawberry. Her curls are bobwebs, slivers of sombra whirled into each other, lost in their own loops, like when we make human knots in PE. She fixes a scrunchie on her back, so a medium white tee hugs her curves. Hey, I dig my foot in the wood chips, heartbeats away from her leopard sandals. I stare at Michael, the homie in all things Resident Evil. He cranes his neck to my starchy collar. Chill, I got you. Our Pokemon Stadium debates dribble across the hallway where 32 pairs of brown and black hands bang poles, chipping at the well-fed coats of turquoise. My mind shuffles through how to defeat a psychic type. If Wobbuffet uses Mirror Coat, then Mewtwo will strike first. And Rosemary's freckles burst in my face like polvorones. Did you just slap my ass? She looks at me looks at Michael. He just be laughing at the smack he gave my hand, getting clammy from what it's lost. I imagine we'd kiss behind the portables, me stuttering to touch her jeans back pocket. The other sixth graders yelling, move! But she doesn't. She just looks cold. Her eyes the color of chocolate milk. Yeah, shout out to school crushes, you know. Let's see. So as I said, it's a very nerdy book. But I think if you're not nerdy, you wouldn't like it. Though if you're probably here, you're probably very nerdy. So I don't think that has to be disclaimed. And so the book has various sections. And so the more you read the book, the more you realize the title is called Hintification, right? So it's a play on words of gentify, gentrify. And you start to realize that it's a course about not just the gentrification of a city, of a geographical place like East Palo Alto, but it's also gentrification of the mind, right? So for those of us who came from first-gen families, going to these institutions, how that changes us, not just in the successful ways that you see we celebrate, but how do we complicate those ideas? How do we really get into the thick of how we have grown and changed through these places? So the book really tries to meditate on that. So the book is in dialogue with many authors, Octavio Paz, hip hop artists like E40, including James Baldwin. So I have this long dialogue with James Baldwin. And so in this poem, I have an epigraph of his. And the epigraph is as follows. I remember having an argument, a most melancholy argument, with a friend of mine concerning our relation to Martin. It was shortly after I celebrated a stormy meeting with Bobby Kennedy, and I was very low. I said we could petition and march and march and march and raise money and give money until we wore ourselves out and the stars began to moan. None of this endeavor would or could reach the core of the matter. It would change nobody's fate. This is James Baldwin's from his book, No Name in the Street. And the poem is called, And the Stars Began to Moan. And the section is a DBQ. So in high school, you had this class called AP US History. And you would take a period like World War II. You'd have primary sources that you'd have to collect. You have to make an argument generated from those primary sources. So the idea in this book is that the primary sources are those fragments of like my most traumatic times in my life. Then I had to respond to it. So this is called And the Stars Began to Moan. And it's a test. So you're taking a test, and the total time of the test is 1 hour and 30 minutes. And here are the directions of the test that I will read to you now. Directions. When fleshing out the essay, consider these questions. When did you first learn to package your family's grief? Can Papa ever take off his work shoes in your poems? Are Juan Pablo and Devante just statistics to cite in scholarship apps? Do they lay still on the autopsy of stats tables? Are they yours to mine? Do you always imagine Felix wearing his orange jumpsuit? Why is it now his jumpsuit? Are they all prisoners to your image? What violences does your mouth now harbor? Have the means become their own end? And I'll read the next poem after that. Since Jenny did a nice little segue, shoot, I'm gonna do the same thing. So the next poem here is called Grading Rubric. Trauma is weighted as follows. Formal essays, 55 to 65%. Right, children of immigrants, 10%. Right, first generation, 15%. Mention the color of the Coyote's van, 10%. Keep family in the past tense, 5%. Write birthplace next to its murder per capita rate, 20%. In class, first 35% in class section. Don't correct them when they say your name wrong, 5%. Go by Tony starting sophomore year, 10%. Stay quiet when they make fun of Keisha, 5%. Believe Tim when he says you just got in because you're 10%. When it's your turn to read, pronounce it like they do, Guatemala, 5%. Participation, 10%. Turn to the person next to you. Debate your belonging. I'll read one more poem. I'm debating which one to read. And I think I'll just screw it and I will just read the one next to it. Yeah, fuck it. This poem is called ESL. After Roger Rivas' work, Semothia Exigua. This is ESL. The tongue has a debut ribbon to slice and applaud, to lose consciousness and wake up indoors. When the smell of cooked chicken creeps into your nose and teeth remember what it means to chew, to make the mouth a gully for the first pale stranger who cradles your head and says, drink. When the glistening neck of his canteen prods your lips and words you've never heard braid in. When the names of the room's dead fill your throat and bedloads of migrants cover their children's mouths each time they knock. When loose threads of tongue fall on your stubby fingers, and soon you unravel how you arrived here, to mourn the Jordans hung on telephone wires, the muscle memories of a coup that stopped mid-street. A tinted face lowers the glass curtain, and suddenly your pickup game's one man short, to still hear his jump shot. When the court chuckled as his elbow was locked in, and 21's just a game, never an age reached. When the pale stranger invites his neighbors, how they marvel at your mouth's archaeology. When wives' parts rot and decide to form book clubs around your grief. When a smile lurks in the corner of your jaw as they proclaim you their latest myth. Gracias, y'all.
So I need to like clap for you. That was great. Thank you.
And then I'm just giving off the energy you were starting it off. Thanks.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I wrote down a few lines from yours that struck me. I think grading rubric was my favorite of the poems that you read. Like so much of that, even though like our backgrounds are like not identical, so much of that really resonated and that ending, debate your belonging.
Appreciate that a lot. You know, what's kind of weird, you mentioned like it's not really similar, but in a way it parallels, because when I was hearing you talk about your poems about the cells and like how they can't be in isolation. I don't know if you've read Jose Olivares's Citizen Illegal, and he has this section called Mexican Heaven. It's like this refrain about Mexican Heaven, this small pithy remarks about like who belongs in Mexican Heaven, who doesn't, right? And it just had this beautiful, like, it almost felt like waves, like you just kept returning to the question. And I felt like the biology, I haven't read your book all the way, but the biology questions you had, I felt like they kept coming back like waves, you know, in terms of the meditation of the science with the discourse and talking about your mom and all that. So it was I loved it.
Thank you. Yeah, I haven't read that. I wrote it down. I'm gonna check it out.
Yeah, no, shout out to my boy Jose. You know, he had that book out through Haymarket, and it's one of those poems you could tell that was like, it used to be, and this is kind of like a craft lesson for those in the audience, but where a poem used to be a big poem, and when you're making a book, you know, you can, and I'm sure we can talk about that too, like how do you turn these not random, but discrete poems into something that belongs in as a unit. And I could just tell the way he wrote it, like, I'm sure, I bet my money that used to be a single poem. But now when you read the book, they punctuate, they intersperse throughout the book. So as you learn about him, his family's migration, growing up in Chicago as a Mexican kid, like you start to, you know, get these little commentaries about Mexican Heaven, and they really hit, they really punch well. So
I love that. And it's funny you say that you bet they used to be one poem, because that's totally true for my biology lesson poems too.
right. Yeah. And it's funny because, like, I don't know, people always wonder, like, oh, like, how do you make a book? And it's not like this, you know, Cinderella where it's like bibbidi bobbidi boo, you know. It's not like, oh, you just know how to do it. Like, it's just random. Like, you're walking one day and you're like, oh, like, maybe it's just been kind of turning in your head. Maybe I should just cut it up. Or it just, once you start having the different furniture of the book, you start to see, oh, like, this fits here, and you know, this section of the poem fits right after this page. And I don't know, how did you go from like how long were your biology poems, and how did you trunk them?
Well, initially I had 4 little sections of that, and I didn't really shrink them beyond just like splitting up the sections, to be honest, because something I do each April for National Poetry Month is I'll like give myself a daily syllabic challenge. So like every day I just give myself like an arbitrary form, like a haiku or like tanka, or I just give myself an arbitrary number of syllables per line, and then I write something. And usually it doesn't lead to anything good, but like once in a while it's like an idea that I can turn into something else.
Well, you know, it's like with a basketball player, like a sport, you just got to get into the practice of shooting Jays, you know, and it may not be your best game, but just reminding it's like muscle memory. It's like
Yeah,
poetic
totally.
memory. It's the same thing. Like, it's like any skill, like you just got to have the habit of thinking poetically. Like, it's not a causality. It's not like, you know, I pick up this paper or pick up this pencil and it drops. Like, those are the laws of gravity, right? So you're learning like the laws of poetry, like just wiring your brain to like you were saying in the poem, like talking about the Greeks and that there's no word for blue. I fucking love that. Like what drew you at that moment? Say, let me give a commentary about there was no concept of blue, but it just felt right, you know?
Yeah.
And there's no like code or law. It's just, you know, this is the right thing to say for this poem.
Totally. So that makes me curious, like, what is your writing practice like? Because you are so busy, like you're a PhD student and you're also a council member. And I don't know what that looks like either of those looks like for you, but I imagine you are very busy.
Yeah, no, I mean, everybody is, right, but I'm not gonna downplay what you said. I definitely do have my work cut out for me, but you know, I don't got no kids. I'm just still a young buck trying to make it out here in terms of my lanes and career. So I think when I first started out, like when I first because I came back from overseas studying in 2020. And obviously that was a pandemic, so it was very like it was very weird, like, and just creating an art of living of anything at that moment in life. I'm sure everybody can relate in the audience. Like, it's just hard. Like, how do you do that? Everything's up in the air. You don't know what next week looks like. Families happening. So when I got into the political lane, that it did feel like in a lot of ways, I kind of put the poetry in the back burner. I mean, I was working on some poems, but I was like, okay, like if I'm gonna really be serious about the political sphere, I'm gonna have to do a lot of work with it, and that's not gonna involve me doing a lot of poetry. I think now, I'm at a point where I'm finding inspiration in my work, like not in my work, like poetry, like in the people I'm around, like going to the park and seeing the kids play, or the street vendors hawking, just being back in my city. Like, people got to understand that I wasn't in EPA for the last 8 years, from 2012 to 2020. And I was 18 when I left, and I was 26 when I came back. So a lot of my formative years, like as a leader, as a man, whatever you want to call me, was not here in the Bay. And so it's really been since 2020, mid-pandemic, that I've really tried to understand, what does poetry mean for me now? Like, outside of a professional setting, for my own daily practice. I think now I'm at a point where I just love the people I serve so much, and I see poetry as an extension of honoring them. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. Like, I want to use this art form to kind of like you were saying with your mom, like honor that life, honor those testimonies, honor those stories. And it's just what compels me. So definitely the paths are converging. And in my doctoral work, I'm actually got a conversation with a faculty member trying to really make that like my baby for like the next few years. But it definitely has been like I had to prioritize it, and it wasn't intuitive. I had to like really intentionally kind of almost like a welder, like weld one career, one aspect of my life to make myself right. And last thing I'll say, and then I know I'm saying a lot, so I'll shut up. But there is a level of maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but almost like not fear, but like almost like reluctant. Like, I want to write, but then I'm like, oh, I don't know about writing. What if I don't got it? What if all these what ifs, right? And maybe you can talk about that. Like, how do you get back on that level? Like, it's like a sport. How do you get back on the court, or get back on the stage, or get back on the field? Like, because there is a level of shit. Like, I did it. People like my book, and people laud it, but this thing that I'm doing, like, it's for me, and maybe it hits, maybe it doesn't, but yeah, it's just there's a level of risk, and not even confidence, but just like affirmation that this is the thing I need to do. Who gives a fuck if it like makes it or not? I don't know. How do you feel about that? Have you come across that? Or are you just, all in?
Yeah, no, I totally relate to a lot of what you said. Also, like what you said about like welding and like just making space for different things, I definitely relate to that. It is hard when like you have these seemingly very separate parts of your life and like career, and you're trying to prioritize everything kind of. Yeah. And I think honestly what made it easier when I was like putting this book together, or like writing these poems, was I never had any intention when I started of like writing a book and like putting this out for everyone. And I think that made it easier to write when I started. I don't know if that was similar for you, or if you like went into this knowing that you were like writing a book.
I think, and that's a good point, like as far as like a lesson that we could like, if it's for people, anytime I do feel like I'm kind of tripping or getting worried, it's when I'm trying to, my mom would always say when I was growing up, like, I want to go see my cousins in Oakland, and she's like tired from work, and she goes, mijo, no comas, no puedes comer el mundo en una mordida. You can't eat the world in a bite. So stop trying to eat the world in a single bite. And I feel like there's so much of just my people's proverb. We don't want to call it like proverbs, that the wisdom in it, that's true. There's truth to that. And I think a book is similar. Like, don't psych yourself out by extrapolating on the organics of what you're working with already, the material, not stretching it. Just like, if it's a series, great. If it's a poem, great. and just trust that the wisdom of the material you're working with will teach you to then build from there. But I think maybe it's capitalism. I don't know what the hell it is, but there's this desire to say, oh, I have this next project, and it's like, maybe I just have this next poem. Like, shit, like we barely got next week as a people, So these are precious artifacts we're working with, and we really gotta like respect the integrity of it. Like, don't try to push it. Don't try to be like, oh, I'm gonna make these 5 poems. And I think as I do fall into that sometimes, where I'm like, all right, like I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna do that. And it's no, like the beauty of what we do, I think, is that it's rather than science or in politics that asks you to generate or produce, like poetry asks you to change yourself first or in the process. Like you can go to a 9-to-5 job and like kind of like just go through it and be kind of half-minded, but poetry is like all in. Like you have to be all in. And if you don't change in some way through that poem, then you haven't poemed. You haven't like done the poem. Maybe you've written a good poem, but you haven't written a poem that's like really part of like the tradition, I think. But I wanted to ask you though, in terms of like scientific background, similarly, like, did you always have like what chicken or the egg? What came first, like for Jenny? Was it the science, the poetry? Was it the same time? Like, did you say one day, you know what, I'm gonna be a banging writer who also does? Like, how did that chronology work for you growing up, or now, or whenever?
Honestly, I would say the poetry or just like writing in general definitely came first. I don't know, I was always like pretty artsy as a kid and like into all of these things that didn't seem very practical as a career. And like, especially just like as a child of immigrants, and like I was an only child, Asian immigrants, my parents lived through the Cultural Revolution, and that really messed up their lives. And like, there was a lot writing on like what I was doing with my life. And so I never really felt like I could take the risk of pursuing like an artistic career. And I mean, this makes it sound like I don't like science, which is not true. Like in college, I was like pre-med. And so I started taking like all these science classes and like lab things. And I really enjoyed my lab experience, because I think what I loved about my lab in college was I went from these like being around like these pre-med gunners who were just like trying to get like ace the test, to this group of people who was just like really curious about the world. And I think that's something that science really has in common with poetry. Just like you start doing it because you want to know something, like you're just curious about connections. And I think over time, like, yeah, maybe it's capitalism, like that is sort of driven away to some extent once you really start pursuing anything. But yeah, like that curiosity was what really drew me to it.
That's beautiful. I'm learning so much. That's awesome. And like, oh, I know we got our MC here, but I was about to say, like, even going back to the nerdy bit about me, even just the word science means to know, right? Like that's the definition, that's the etymology of it. So it's like, you're right. There is a level of, when you professionalize something, it's an awesome thing, because we're so privileged to even be in this space, to extend poetry beyond our private life and to share it as like a professional practice. But with that is like the underside of like, don't lose that, like that dewy-eyed, that almost romantic of like, I'm gonna learn something at the end of this. I'm gonna understand something about me or the people I'm writing about better in a different way through that. And I think like that's definitely something that I share with the people, like communities, like not losing that enthusiasm, that love for the game, no matter how well you're funded or how well you're in it, how many books you're in, which, I ain't there yet, but I'm sure we will be. So we just got to remind ourselves to keep each other accountable.
Yeah, totally.
Amazing. It's been lovely to hear you both talk. We do have some audience questions, but I wanted to open with a question that I think really connects to what you both are talking about right now. You both have a fair amount in common as poets, like geographically, of course, even though your poetry, I think, is aesthetically different. But something else that you both have in common that I think is really interesting is you're both multidisciplinarians. Like you're poet hyphen, Jenny, you're a poet hyphen scientist, and like Antonio, you're poet hyphen politician. Like you're blending these two sort of realms of your life together. And I think the overlap of your other disciplines is clear in your poetry, but something that I'm really curious about is how does your view as a poet influence the other side, the side that is the non-poetry side, if we want to oversimplify things? Like how does, because like we see you bring the political and the scientific into your art. In what ways do you think you bring or don't bring like your art to your other endeavors?
Yeah, you want me to kick it off and then you can kind of go from there?
Sounds good.
All right, for sure. And I'll just like warm it up. I don't got a whole lot of eloquent stuff to say right now, but I will say that I think, especially in like mainstream politics, because everything's political, right? Like who you date, where you buy, what you wear, blah, 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 blah. Oh, that's how you talk. Oh, that's political. That's my opinion. But in terms of the mainstream two-party system, local government, that's that kind of traditional definition of politics. I think very much it tends to be more in our county, my county especially, conservative. We're kind of changing from old boys club. Like there is this wave, kind of like in poetry, where you do have a new generation of people, queer, women of color, but there is this kind of old guard, not even old guard, but just this kind of old traditions that inherent to what you represent, who you are. You are here to change at the very least and challenge. I think there's a certain level of cynicism that sometimes happens in politics where it can only get done if you scratch this person's back or if you go to this dinner. And I think while we have to always, at least in my position, like reckon with that, poetry allows me to always hold on to the possibility that things can be different. Even in my downness of downs where I'm like, this thing's not gonna pass, or the community is divided, or even nationally, like I think I'm grateful that I'm a poet because it insists on me to push what's possible, to imagine a better environment for my community and then branch out from there. And also just like, I think when we wield it, it's a humanizing project. Like it allows me to really make human people, and not like this romantic, heroic way of the single mom working two jobs. I mean, like people are just fraught. And I think too often people of immigrants, my community, other communities, I'm sure Jenny's as well, it's like we're even in liberal place, we're painted as like these heroes or like these people who are invulnerable. And it's like, we're not. Like there's a lot of pain, a lot of plight. And I think to really do justice to that, to really do a decent job to nuancing that, I think requires a poetic eye of care, of empathy, of love. And I think poetry will always demand of me to love, like, and love first. Like even if the content of the poem is painful, it doesn't seem loving, there's always an engine like chugging it to go beyond like what are the limitations of now. And I think that is something that I hope to never lose, and slap me in the face if I do.
All right, I'll remember that you said that. I really love that. And I think, yeah, as far as science goes, I agree with that, like humanizing aspect of poetry. I specifically have been in a science that touches on medicine, which is a very human thing. And yet when you get caught up in what you're doing, and I think even on like the clinical side, even though I'm not seeing patients, even the people who see patients forget that they're people after a while because you get so busy, and that can be even harder like when you are in the lab. And I'm no longer in the lab, just for context. I'm more on like the business end of things now. And like one of the things that I remember from my training at my current job is always describing things like when we're writing about a disease, like write about like patients with blank disease and not just like this drug is treating this disease. And that's something that I appreciate. And I think maybe as a poet, really like that struck me as a great thing for them to have said. Because I've gotten into conversations with like classmates at various points for, I don't know, and I've like sort of reprimanded people for like forgetting that human aspect. And I think like also just as like someone who had to face the healthcare system, like as a caregiver, as a patient, that is something that's like often top of mind, is like not forgetting that this person who has cancer, who's like in this clinical trial, who is on like the other side of things, like they have children, they have parents, they have dreams, and all of these things that are being set aside because they're sick, and it's a really difficult experience. So yeah, I think, and that's something that I always try to remember in my work.
Absolutely. I love this idea that you both seem to have landed on of like poetry and language as an affirmation of our humanity, because I think that's why poetry speaks to so many people, and also why it resonates with us in ways that we can't always explain. So I think that's such beautiful answers from both of you. So thank you for sharing. On that note, we have an audience question. This person asks, how do you employ these languages commonly thought of as not poetic, so the scientific or the political, to create such beautiful poetry? They'd love to hear what your sort of thought process and approach is when doing that.
I can kick us off this time since you did last time. I would push back against that, and this idea that the scientific is not poetic, or that anything is not poetic. Something I really like to think about is just the different definitions of words, like in science and in like, I don't know, everyday language. I started off with a poem where the title was like the definition of a focal point in optics. And so often when I am writing a poem, I'm thinking about like, what is this like word that I've been obsessing over, and what can it mean in all these different contexts? And there is a poetry in like finding the connections between those contexts.
I'll build off that. I think what Jenny's saying, I think what the question really has to understand is there is no like essential poetic language. Like there is no language that is more poetic than the other, in my opinion. I think that I subscribe to the idea, the theory that that poetry and literature, actually, Terry Eagleton writes this, literary critic, literature is just awareness of language, right? So there's a school of poetry which was just like you read off a phone book, right? When there was this thing called phone book for the young bloods. You just read off of them, and so like, what do you bring to the table? And I think that's the question. Like, a famous poet told me, poetry is an emotional sport, so you have to bring that emotion in, and then the language is almost second, I think, in a way. Like, language is the means by which we poem, right? It's our instrument, right? Jazz have the sax, pianists have the piano, we have the human voice, and we have language. That's it. That is our only instrument. And I think in that definition, I think that what I bring to the table is my own traditions and my own intersections. As a kid growing up in the Bay, a son of Mexican immigrants, influenced by hip hop, growing up in a historically Black city like EPA that has so many different communities, and really celebrating that and honoring how that's made me language, how that's made me understand English, and I think turning English from the province of the Shakespeares of the world, or like a European tradition, and really understanding that English is international for better and for worse. And that includes the community I'm a part of. And so this question of how I introduce the poetry and the non-poetry, I think is also a question of assimilation. So it's a question of civics. It's a question of citizenship. It's, what is your status in this language? What is your status in this country? I think, and to me, I bring that very political lens of like, it's whatever I'd like it to be. And I think that the lens of really thinking everything is up for grabs and inviting that and bringing that to the picture, that is the first step. And the second step is your aesthetics, right? So, you know, Jenny has a certain way of putting English together, words together, and I do. For me, sound is so important. Bilingualism, references to things I grew up with. I think doing that unabashedly, unapologetically, quote unquote, is really important. And I think the more you just listen to that intuition and really open that space up, I think the more that question is kind of like a false distinction. You know, I'm not saying it's a bad or bad thing. I'm just saying that I think there is a level of, I think everything is capable of being poetic. Like when a guy, I know this meme, right? This meme of this Latino dude selling raspados, and like he has his Venmo on his little rickety car. Like to me, that is poetic. Like putting him making a Venmo and him adding the Venmo, and then to me, like it's this ability of like, there's this beauty in the struggle and artifying that. Like to me, that's poetry. So it's just, what do you see as poetic, and what don't you see? And I think that to me is much more a liberating understanding of poetry than to say I've received poetry is T.S. Eliot and poetry is this, and you know, tradition. Yeah, that's true, but like I'm in the business of democratizing. So
that's a beautiful way of thinking about it from you both. I think maybe the question is not how do I make the not poetic poetic, but rather where the poetry is already here, like how do we discover it, which is such a beautiful way of framing the creative process and also way of seeing the world. So thank you both for that insight. We are getting close to time, but we do have one more audience question. Would you guys be down to just answer? Might go a little late, but does that sound okay? Sweet. So our last question, this audience member asks, both of you have experience in academia, of course. So how has academia played a part in shaping your poetry, its purpose, its content? How are institutions nourishing or limiting that poetic expression? And they note that they're asking because there's someone who wants to return to school, but is also grappling with this idea that like poets can't be made in universities. So yeah, what do you both, especially both of you with such academic backgrounds, I'm sure you'll have a lot of insight.
I was gonna say, I can definitely start because my you know, it is something that I definitely do think about, and it's a provocative question. Can poets be made in universities? I think you have to be, as a mentor of mine says, strategic. You can't be, you know, you have to be in it but not of it, because I do think institutions do have a way of, if you let them, to deaden language. However, you know, don't sleep on the amount of resources that universities have, particularly time and leisure and people who are thinking the same thing as you are. So I think creating a space where you guys are thinking about the same issues, even if the environment itself is, you know, giving us propagandizing or giving a certain discourse about how you poem, you know, that's, consider that back in the background, not white noise, if you will, you know, but don't let it cancel out or like, you know, you have this time and space to write, and that should not be underestimated by any means. So I think in terms of, well, I'll stop there. I want to hear from Jenny, but I think just always remembering that caveat is really important.
No, I'm glad you went first, actually, since you are actively in academia. And I like the points that you brought up. I feel like, I don't know, I was in academia for something that was like so different, or like had such different objectives than say poeming in like this book that I don't know, it's kind of hard to like answer this question from that perspective. Because in some ways I don't necessarily feel like I have the same academic background as a lot of writers, I guess, if that makes sense. Since I didn't actually do writing academically. And so in some ways I am kind of glad for that, because it allowed me to approach poetry and just like language from like a very different place. But to Antonio's point about like the resources of academia, like there are times when I like consider going back to school too for writing, just for that time.
Sorry, and I think embedded in that question, because there's so many presumptions we make in questions or just things that we're not seeing or things that we hold, is this like you having to hold down like this is your voice, your authenticity, being authentic. What is your belief, your ethos that you bring to the table? And I think that there is this level of imposter syndrome, of culture shock, of like having to front and fake it till you make it. That I'm sure when I was in my MFA, even as equitable and as welcoming it was, just because of my age and where I was in my trajectory, there was a level of that. And so I think a lot of times that it's not even just institution, which definitely universities have that effect. It's also just when you're surrounded by all these wonderful, brilliant people, what is, really believing that you are meant to be in that space and you will contribute and you will grow in spite of and because of at the same time those places. And just that internal conversation is hard to have when you're young or when you're in a place in life. And so I think just recognizing the process of it and that both things can be true, and just walking day to day through that journey. Just reading and being with people in company can really do wonders.
Absolutely. Bringing it all back to like the community and the space and like what it's all about. Well, with that was our last audience question. Thank you both so much for such an interesting conversation, for sharing your work with us. It was really just a lovely event. And thank you to our audience who were, blowing up the chat and saying all sorts of wonderful things. So also both of you should feel free to just peek at the chat real quick and see the nice stuff folks are saying about you. I'm going to drop a link in the chat if anyone doesn't have a copy of Jenny or Antonio's books. You can purchase it at the links that I just dropped in the chat until 9 a.m. tomorrow. That link will be live. So maybe you've read one person's book and you want to read the other, or you simply have to buy copies for your friends or what have you. Feel free to use that link. And yeah, thank you to our audience again for coming out and supporting such wonderful work. And thank you to our authors, Jenny Chi and Antonio López, for generously sharing that work with us and taking this time to have such a lovely and insightful conversation. Yeah, thank you both. It's been so lovely. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great night.
Everybody, stay safe.